Okay, today we're doing Siman Kofei Halacha Beis. The topic is Yad Soledes Bo. So for many halachas, the threshold, or when something is considered hot or cooked or something like that, some special status, when it gets to something called Yad Soledes Bo. What does that mean? So Rashi explains that Yad Soledes Bo means it's so hot that if somebody would touch it, he would pull his hand back because it would be uncomfortable to hold it. It's too hot. It's similar to what we call in English a withdrawal reflex. Okay, so there's a couple of examples where this halacha is relevant. I have some examples to show you where this halacha is relevant. Some of where it's a chumrah and some of where it's a kula. So first is for Blios. That's what we talk about in our dinim. When something is Yad Soledes Bo, Blia could happen. The cooler side of that is that on Shabbos we say is if something is already cooked once it reached Yad Soledes Bo, so ein bishul acha bishul. If it hit that high of a temperature, then there's no, then it can't be mevushal, so to speak, a second time. You can't be over for cooking it again. Another chumrah is you can't put meat into hot water before malicha. That's a chumrah if it's Yad Soledes Bo. And the cooler side is if you cook wine to the point that it's Yad Soledes Bo, according to many Poskim, that's considered mevushal and it can't become stam yain afterwards. Okay, another chumrah and kula, bishul on Shabbos. When you get, I should have put this next to ein bishul bishul. When you get liquid up to the temperature of Yad Soledes Bo, you're over on bishul. So that's a chumrah. And there's a kula of libun kal that there are certain types of kashrus that when you get the metal on the other side to be the temperature of Yad Soledes Bo, now it's been kashrus, so that's a kula. If you've reached that temperature, it's a kula. And on some other ones here on the screen here, something's kavu l'maiso. When it hits that temperature, in certain cases, you shouldn't use mayim achronim that or netilas yadayim that Yad Soledes Bo. We sometimes make a kula. We kasher the kavush with that. Okay, so a bunch of different chumras and kulas of where the din of Yad Soledes Bo. When this temperature is relevant for. Now, the temperature is Yad Soledes Bo when a person's hand would pull back from it. So you would think it's really easy. Just stick your hand onto the food or into the water or the liquid, and you'll see if it's Yad Soledes Bo. But the Gemara says, people have different tolerances for heat. So it's not really a good idea to just do it by your hand, because what I think is hot might not be what you think is hot. So that's not the best way to test it. Now, the Gemara says, okay, so since you shouldn't do that, this is too subjective to have it tested by having people just stick their fingers onto something to decide if it's Yad Soledes Bo. The Gemara says, okay, so what you should do is it's the temperature with kresu shel tinuk nichvas bo, when the stomach of an infant would burn if you put it into that amount of heat. It becomes scalded when you put into that amount of heat. Now, it just is really strange. I don't know how to answer this. It's a really strange. I mean, a little bit I can answer maybe, but it's not. It's a really strange thing the Gemara is saying. Don't put your hand into it. Don't use your hand for testing because people's hands are subjective. Okay, we got that. So that's a good idea. Don't do that. So instead, you should do it by seeing when a baby's stomach's going to get scalded. I mean, who's going to try that? What are you going to do? Go to line up 50 babies and start putting hot things onto them to see when their stomachs get burned? No one's going to do that. So what kind of idea is that to say, go by kresu shel tinuk nichvas bo? It seems like what am I supposed to do with that piece of information? Yad Soledes Bo, at least I could guess. You could put your hand onto it and see if your hand pulls back or doesn't pull back. I'm not really sure what you're supposed to do with this shear that's kresu shel tinuk nichvas bo. So I mean, the best I can say is some poskim, because a lot of the vagueness of how much Yad Soledes Bo is, which we'll talk about, a lot of that vagueness, there are poskim who say is that you should consider Yad Soledes Bo l'chumra, anything that's at all hot, anything even the tiniest bit hot, you should consider to be Yad Soledes Bo. And maybe that's what the Gemara means. Maybe when the Gemara says Yad kresu shel tinuk nichvas bo is if you were giving a bath to a baby, you'd be super careful to make sure the water is not too hot for the baby, because you're so cautious that you'd be super careful to not do it. So the Gemara is saying, don't test it with your finger to see if when your hand pulls back. Think about it as if you were deciding whether to put a baby into this bath. Would you be worried that the kresu shel tinuk would be nichvas by putting into this temperature, which is sort of like a chumrah? Say be super careful. That's not the way to measure it. It's a way for you to realize how cautious you have to be. No, maybe that's shot like Gemara. I don't know. Anyhow. And this. So anyhow, back to the Gemara. The Gemara said was you shouldn't measure this just by putting your hand into it. So usually we think of that as the chumrah because you'll be too. You might be able to handle heat more than somebody else, and the opposite is probably true. Also, there are cases when it's a cooler to say Yad Soledes Bo, so you might be too lenient in what temperature to get it to decide is Yad Soledes Bo. Now, that's all the Gemara. In the past, let's say 100 years, the world has become much more scientific, and we Yidden have become more scientific with the world also. So Poskim started giving exact temperatures for what they think Yad Soledes Bo. So now they didn't do that. They didn't make that measurement by sticking their finger in. Because I just told you the Gemara says. We'll see some people did, but most didn't want to just stick their finger into something because the Gemara says don't do that. The Gemara says sticking your finger in is not a good way to measure Yad Soledes Bo. So what they did was they went around and they found a real wide assortment of places where Chazal describes something as being hot or cold. Hot meaning we assume that means Yad Soledes Bo. Cold means not Yad Soledes Bo. And then they measure that thing. So that was a way of we hear Chazal telling us something is cold. That means it's not Yad Soledes. Something is hot means it is Yad Soledes. So to help us get narrow down what that temperature should be. And it's really amazing the list of places where Poskim found things of Chazal describing things, and then they were able to go measure them. I'm going to get to the numbers in a second. That will be later, second half of what we're talking about. But for now, I want to focus on the concept of what's going on over here. That is, these Poskim are saying is that Yad Soledes Bo is going to be a certain temperature. And it's the same thing whether it's an egg, a cow, a duck, water, milk, oil. All these things are things that Poskim mentioned. Okay, it's all the same. Okay, so for example, milk comes out of a cow at 40 degrees Celsius. That's 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The Bahag says, someone found that the Bahag says that milk coming out of a cow is considered cold. So Rambam said, well, if milk coming out of a cow is cold, and milk comes out of a cow at 40 degrees Celsius, it must be that 40 degrees Celsius is not Yad Soledes Bo. And he said, and therefore we could use that for everything. It happens to be I'm measuring it based on the milk coming out of a cow, but he's saying we expand that to be everything. Okay, now that sounds perfectly logical. We get that perfectly. But somebody named Reb Tzvi Aryeh Young, for those who know, is the son of Ram Chaim Young. That's a name from the past for many people. But Reb Tzvi Aryeh Young said that something seems not accurate about this. And that is because it comes from a popular confusion between two different terms, the terms heat and temperature. And what I'm going to show you what I mean by that when I say the difference between heat and temperature. And that is like this. If you go into a room, in this room, let's say in any room, and it's been 70 degrees Fahrenheit for the past bunch of hours. Okay, this room has been whatever temperature it is for all day, all night. So you assume that basically everything in the room is going to be at that temperature, right? I mean, except maybe the heater, it's in the corner there, maybe the heater is hotter, but everything else is, give or take, should be the same temperature. Okay, so now if you now go to a room where everything's the same temperature, and you touch a thick piece of metal. Okay, so in my kitchen we did this with, stick your hand onto a cast iron griddle. Okay, it's a thick, heavy piece of metal. And then you put another hand onto a paperback book. Okay, and what you're going to find out is that the metal feels much colder than the book does. Okay, they're both the same temperature, but they're not the same heat. Okay, and again, they had the same temperature. They're both 70 degrees. That's what your thermostat said. It's at 70 degrees. They're both 70 degrees. But the heat that you feel is not the same for both of those. The metal feels colder than the book does. And the reason is because, the physicists will say, the reason is because of something called thermal conductivity. Okay, which means is how well does the item conduct heat? So, the griddle, the metal, has very good thermal conductivity. And therefore, what goes on is that when you put your hand onto it, it draws heat away from your hand very quickly. It's very good at conducting heat. So by drawing away all that heat from your hand, it makes your hand feel cold. That's what cold is that the heat is escaping. So you feel cold because the metal is really good at drawing away heat from your hand. In contrast, the book has poor thermal conductivity. So it doesn't pull away heat from your hand well. So therefore, it doesn't feel as cold as the metal does when you put your hand onto And you can actually, now let's go a step past that, of this idea of thermal conductivity, and that is, go ahead and put a piece of ice onto the metal and onto the paperback book. Okay, I'm going to do that here for the imagined audience. Put a piece of ice. In this case, I'm putting it onto a box of tissues, a tissue box, and onto the metal, a big piece of metal that we have in here. Okay, and then I'll put it onto a computer case. Also, another thing over here. Okay, and what's going to happen is that when you do that, what happens is, after a couple of seconds, the ice, excuse me, after a couple of seconds, you already see that the ice on the metal is melting. Okay, the ice on the metal melts, while the ice that's sitting on the paperback book, or in my case, the tissue box and the computer case, that it could sit there for a while, and you won't see any melting going on there. Okay, so it seems like it's counterintuitive. I'm here, as I've been talking, I just put the ice on. It's already we're getting a puddle on the piece of metal that I have here. The tissue box has got nothing, and the computer case has got nothing either. They're just sitting there. The ice is just sitting there, and there's already a whole puddle forming on the piece of metal. There's this metal machine that we have over here. Okay, and it seems counterintuitive. I told you that the metal feels colder. Well, if it's colder, you think it would keep the ice longer. The ice would not melt on it. And the paperback book, I told you, did not feel so cold. You think that it should be the ice should melt faster on there. But the answer is, let me just get down. We're making a puddle in here. I'm sorry. I'm going to clean up my mess over here a little bit, just because. Whoa, the mouse should make a whole puddle here. In these couple of seconds that I've been talking, there's a whole puddle forming here. Listen, I got to clean it up because I'm making a mess in here. Take the other ice off. Okay, and the answer is, thermal conductivity explains this as well. And that is like this: the heat transfers really quickly from the big piece of metal, between the metal and the ice. So what's going on is the heat that's in the metal is transferring very well into the ice and causing the ice to melt, as opposed to the metal, the heat that's in the box of tissues or the paperback book has poor conductivity. It transfers very poorly, and since it will take a long time before the ice will start to melt. The ice will stay cold for much longer and won't start to melt. So that's thermal conductivity, and that tells us already that how hot something else is not the same as what temperature the item is at. Again, in our cases, everything had the same temperature, but they weren't the same, so to speak, hot. So, Yad Soledes Bo, which Chazal tell us is how something feels, is something that we shouldn't be measuring just by its temperature. Okay, meaning the hotter something is, the higher the temperature of something is, the hotter it will feel. But that doesn't mean that two things that are at the same temperature are going to feel the same. So that means is, just because what's Yad Soledes Bo on a cow or on milk is not necessarily the same thing for an egg or for water or for grape juice or 110 other things. That we're not going to be able to use the same temperature to measure Yad Soledes Bo for each thing. Yad Soledes Bo is the heat of the item, not the temperature. Now, thermal conductivity is not the only thing that decides how hot something feels. There's something else that physicists call specific heat capacity, which is the amount of heat that it takes, the amount of energy that has to be absorbed into something to increase its temperature. So if it has a higher capacity, that means is it takes in more energy to get it to the higher to this temperature. So that means is, if we have two items that are at the same temperature, and one has a higher specific heat capacity, it's going to feel hotter. And it feels hotter because it took way more energy to get this to the temperature. Let's say, again, we're in the room at 70 degrees. It took more energy had to be absorbed into this to get it to 70 degrees than the other thing. And since it took more energy, when you touch it, that energy can transfer to you or to something else. And therefore, it feels hotter. We have a hot cup of water, depending on how much energy went in to make the water hot, will depend on how, also plays a role on how hot the thing feels. Okay, so that means again, two things can be at the same temperature, but one will feel hotter than the other because one has a higher specific heat capacity than the other one does. Okay, now these two factors that I mentioned, there's actually a third, but we're not going to talk about. These two that I mentioned, thermal conductivity and specific heat capacity, I want to give an example of that right from the Gemara. Okay, this idea that I'm saying that heat and temperature are not the same based on these two factors is actually right in the Gemara, and that is, I told you that the Gemara says the one Gemara that talks about Yad Soledes Bo, the Gemara tells you how to decide, not what Yad Soledes Bo. They tell you how do you know when something's Yad Soledes Bo, and I told you about sticking your hand in and those measures. The Gemara is talking about two different things. Two examples are in the Gemara: olive oil and water. Those are two examples that the Gemara is talking about in deciding when something is in making the decision of Yad Soledes Bo. And now, if you look at the chart, you see that olive oil. Water has about double the specific heat capacity of olive oil. Water is at 4.19 and olive oil is 1.97. So it's about 4 to 2. Okay, water absorbs about twice as much energy to get to a temperature than olive oil does. In thermal conductivity, water is almost 3 times as much as olive oil. Water is at 0.598 and olive oil is at 0.17. So it's about 0.6 to a little less than 0.2. So it's more than 3 times amount of thermal conductivity. So that means that if you had water and oil that were at the same temperature, they were both at a certain temperature, the water will have absorbed more energy to reach that temperature, has more specific heat capacity, and it's much better at transferring that heat that it has to something else. It has 3 times the thermal conductivity that olive oil does. And therefore, the water will, for both of those reasons, feel way hotter than the olive oil will do. And in fact, we tested this ourselves. You may remember a couple of months ago, we had some kind of a meeting about something, and I took a pot of olive oil and I heated it up to 160 degrees in a crock pot. It was at about 160 degrees, and people stick their hands into it, and they didn't think it was hot. Even though we're going to see that everyone knows that if you stick 160 degree hand in 160 degree water, it would for sure be Yad Soledes Bo. You'd for sure pull your hand out of it. We'll talk about that in a minute, about people actually did testing with that. You'll pull your hand out right away. And that's because water has much higher thermal conductivity and specific heat capacity. So when the Gemara said Yad Soledes Bo, for these two examples, the Gemara says, how do you test Yad Soledes Bo? And it's talking about these two examples. It did not have in mind that they should be the same temperature. Not at all. They should be the same heat, not the same temperature. Bear in mind, thermometers weren't invented until like 1,000 years after the Gemara was written. Okay, so the temperature didn't mean, there was no such thing as temperature. The Gemara didn't mean temperature, it meant how hot it should be. So all of this, everything that I'm telling you now is a question on what the idea that Poskim are trying to make Yad Soledes Bo into a temperature. We could theoretically make a temperature for Yad Soledes Bo, but we'd have to do it for each different things. Okay, we couldn't make one temperature across the board for all items. This is Yad Soledes Bo. Like I'm going to show you soon. If we figure out that ducks are not Yad Soledes Bo at 113 degrees, or eggs are not Yad Soledes Bo at 136 degrees. It has nothing to do with anything. You can't import that from here to something else and say, okay, well, therefore water or milk is Yad Soledes Bo at a certain temperature. Ducks and milk are not the same thing. And so they both, at the temperature where one is hot is not the temperature where the other one is hot. Okay? So that's a question now. Poskim are again, they're doing it, the Poskim are doing this based on the assumption. And until, however many minutes ago when I started, most people assume, which is that heat and temperature are the same thing, and that's what Rabbi Young is pointing out, is that they're really not. And in fact, as we dig into it, you find out the science of it, that they're not the same thing. So what's going on here? That why are we using temperatures from all over Poskim, all over the place? We're finding these places where Chazal calls something hot or cold, and then using that. That's not a right way to make the determination for other items. So the best I could do, we'll give a hashkafa type answer, if I could say that. Of course, the halacha is ein lo dayin ela ma she'ein avrois, and most people assume that heat and temperature are the same thing, and therefore they made these conclusions. But and not realizing that they were the same. But at the same time, let's think about it for a second. Yad Soledes Bo, as I told you, is a shir that's relevant for many things. It's a shir that's pretty accessible to people. You stick your hand into things. I know the Gemara says not exactly do it, but it should be relatively easy to figure out. and yet this is range, real big range of temperatures. We're going to talk about the actual temperatures in a second. A real big range of temperatures. You think it's really odd that such a something that should be so obvious and so relevant, and so this is not a halacha, something that had run something to the Beis Hamikdash. This is this halacha l'maisa for lots of people. There should be such a range. So we can only hashkafically say because there was this mistake, there was this obvious mistake to confuse heat and temperature. The Baruch Shalom made sure that we had this really big range, and we're very machmir on Yad Soledes Bo, l'chumra and l'kula, as I'm going to talk about soon. We have this big range, and we're very machmir. We say it's Yad Soledes Bo even from a very low temperature. It's not Yad Soledes Bo l'kula even to a very high temperature. As the way the Baruch Shalom said, I'm going to take care of it. I'll make sure I'll give you a temperature that's going to work for everything. This temperature that I'm going to give you, temperature is the wrong way to do it. Really, heat is the way to do it. But you want to have a temperature? Okay, I'll make sure that it works out, that the place can come up with this vagueness so that we have a temperature that works for everything. Basically, it works for no matter what you start with, it always works. Okay, that's a hashkafa type answer. But to this, what seemingly is a very strong question of what a place could do. Okay, so we said at the beginning that there are times when being Yad Soledes Bo is a chumrah. So when you hit that temperature, you've now something's bad, something's more chumrah, and there are temperatures where it's a cooler. Okay, so really, of course, there's only one thing which is Yad Soledes Bo. There's a certain temperature, bad word, not temperature, certain amount of heat that's Yad Soledes Bo. But because we're not sure what it is, we're machmir in both directions. So we say, on the low end, you want to say something chumrah when something is Yad Soledes Bo, well, be machmir even if it's at a very low temperature, relatively low temperature. You want to be mekel about something being Yad Soledes Bo, don't be mekel until it hits this very high temperature. Okay, so we're machmir in both directions. Okay, so I'm going to tell you. Let's start with the low end. Okay, on the low end, I have here 4 different shitas in Poskim in contemporary Poskim, relatively contemporary Poskim, of what the temperature is for Yad Soledes Bo. The Chazon Ish says it's 104 degrees. Okay, this is the low end. If it hits this thing, then you're saying l'chumra. It's Yad Soledes Bo. Many of these people said their numbers in Celsius, so these are rounded always into the Fahrenheit and Celsius. I rounded in both directions just to make it easier to talk about. The Chazon Ish said 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 Celsius. Ramosha said 110 degrees, which is 43 degrees Celsius. Shlomo Zalman said 113 degrees, which is 45 degrees Celsius, and Aaron Kotler said 120 degrees, which is 49 degrees Celsius. Okay, so l'chumra, when are we machmir to say something that's this hot is considered Yad Soledes Bo? Let's say for Bitul on Shabbos or something like that. So or Blios transferring. So most American hashkachas follow what Aaron Kotler said, which was at 120 degrees. In Eretz Yisrael, I think it's more common to follow Shlomo Zalman, 45 degrees Celsius or 113 degrees. Again, so this is the chumrah. When you say when it hits this temperature, you've now heated something up. Someone just asked a question a few minutes ago about cooking something on Shabbos. When there's a problem with Bishul, so we would say if it hit 120 degrees, you're over on Bishul for hitting to that temperature. Okay, so this is the chumrah, the low end numbers for the chumrah. Okay, now most of the Poskim who I see who talk about these kind of things talk about that temperature, the low end, and when it's a chumrah. Not so many. Not so many spoke about the other side, the high end. At what point can we be mekel and say it's so hot, it's for sure Yad Soledes Bo by this point? We say in bishach bish, let's say, for example. I'm going to give you some people who did talk about it, but it's not much about that. Like for example. People like who are, so to speak, not talking about it. And Dayan Weiss and Sheva Levi have a question when they're talking about whether wine that's mavushal, what if it's heated to Yad Soledes Bo, is it considered mavushal? So roundaboutly, that they're like passing by temperatures that they're talking about. It was either 60 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Celsius. That's 140 or 122 in Fahrenheit. And they're assuming that it's mavushal, and they're shy, but that's not really what they're talking about. They're really talking about is mavushal good enough to make it can be considered? Is Yad Soledes Bo enough to make it considered mavushal for stam yayin? So, but they're not really talking about the number. So one notable exception to this of people who of not giving numbers for the, so to speak, for the high end is Ramosha, who gives numbers, but what's a little Okay, let put Ramesh on the side for 1 second. I'm sorry. Ramesh on the side. Let me just tell you some of the people who did some tests. Just for, I'm not sure if it fits right now, but people who did now. There's some people who went ahead and tried to do tests to try to find out what Yad Soledes Bo is, and what I'm going to show you is most of those people were finding things that were not Yad Soledes Bo. So they were getting higher and higher temperatures. Say this is not Yad Soledes Bo. Okay, well, for the cooler, that's relevant to know how high can you go and still not be Yad Soledes Bo. So I mentioned Shlomo Zalman said that 113 degrees is not Yad Soledes Bo. That's I'm sure. How did he know that? Because the Gemara says that at the base of Shechita is not hot. The Gemara says in Chulin, base of Shechita is not hot. Somehow we decided that duck necks are the hottest ones, and somehow that duck necks are 113 degrees. None of all of that is a little bit vague where the practical information came from. But that's what we decided that duck necks. That since the Gemara says base of Shechita is not hot, therefore we could decide that 113 is not Yad Soledes Bo. Okay, now that's not very high. So that's where it comes from to say anything above that might be Yad Soledes Bo. Okay, but now let's look at some other ones. Now around Cutler and Dayan Weiss both did the testing that the Gemara, so to speak, the Gemara says not to do, to stick your finger into water. I heard this from Heinemann, how he did it, and Rabbi Eider also explains it a little bit, that Rabban literally had people walking in, and he had different pots of water at different temperatures, stick their hands in, and when it hit 120, that's when people were Soledes Bo, or in Dayan Weiss, he measured by how long could you keep your hand in certain temperatures of water, and he came up with ideas of what's Yad Soledes Bo, what's Safek Yad Soledes Bo. So they said 120 degrees is Yad Soledes Bo. Okay, now, but the rest I'm going to show you are testing that came out that was not Yad Soledes Bo. There's someone, Rabbi Chiel Avram Zilber, who did a bunch of tests, and he said there are Poskim with the Darkei Tshuva, or maybe I think it's in Darkei Tshuva brings, that says if you could, there were places who said if you could drink tea without any effort, like it's not hard to drink, if you drink it straight, then that's obviously not Yad Soledes Bo. He measured that and it was 136 degrees. Okay, so he's saying Lakula. It's still not Yad Soledes Bo even at 136 degrees. I'm using only Fahrenheit numbers for this, even though most of these were in Celsius. He also did Kashrus Nichvas Bo. I don't remember how we tested that. And he said that 145 degrees is not Kashrus Nichvas Bo. So when the Gemara said you should test using Kashrus Nichvas Bo, he said, okay, at 145 it's still not Kashrus Nichvas Bo, so it's not Yad Soledes Bo. And lastly, he also did, together with Professor Lev, he said the Gemara says that eggs are Kali Abishal. So it means an egg that gets to a certain temperature should be cooking. It's really easy to cook. And Bishal happens at Yad Soledes Bo, and 158 degrees, they still weren't seeing any meaningful change in the egg. So they said, okay, so it must not be Yad Soledes Bo even. So that's a way an even high number. Okay, so back to where we were, Ramosha. Ramosha is the one from the Poskim who's giving a number, a cooler number. You could be Mekel and say something is Mavur. Again, one of the cases he's talking about, for Shabbos or for Stam Yayin. For Shabbos, if it's already Mavush, we'd say in Bishal Acha Bishal. So Ramosha gives a number, but what's really uncharacteristic is that he gives three different numbers for how much Yad Soledes Bo is. Okay, and when he's talking about Ein Bishal Acha Bishal for Shabbos, he says 160 degrees, which is 71 degrees centigrade, 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That's for sure. At 160 for sure. That's for sure mavushal. You could be makel and assume that it's mavushal, and therefore Ein Bishal Acha Bishal. But two tshuvas where he's talking about Stam Yayin, and he says, how should you know when the Stam Yayin is Yad Soledes Bo? Because according to him, that's the shear for being mavushal, that it can't become Stam Yayin afterwards. He says 165 or 175 degrees, which are 74 or 80 degrees Celsius. Okay, so that's really unusual. Here he is going out of his way to tell you the number that should be considered mavushal, yet in three different tshuvas he has three different numbers. So we're now going to go on a limb over here and say we can maybe be miyash of this stira, but remember, my point at the beginning was to say is there's not heat and temperature are not the same thing, and water has a specific heat capacity. How much heat does it take in before to get hotter at 4.19, and it's a little bit more than wine and grape juice had. So it could be when he was talking about Hilchos Shabbos, Ramosha just took a pot of water and he said, "How will I know when it's Yad Soledes Bo?" He took a pot of water and it was 160 degrees. It was Yad Soledes Bo. He said, "This is for sure Yad Soledes at 160 degrees," but because the water at 160 degrees is so hot that to him it was obvious that was not Yad Soledes Bo, that it was Yad Soledes Bo. But when he was trying to do for Stam Yayin, he might have done the test. I have no idea, but he might have done the test with grape juice and wine, trying to say, at what point is it Yad Soledes Bo? So he took a pot of grape juice or a pot of wine and cooked it up and said, let's see what temperature. Well, they have a little bit lower specific heat capacity, so they're going to feel hot they won't feel hot so hot until a higher temperature, 165 or 175. So it could be that each one of them, he was answering the shayla for the thing, in other words, without probably realizing this thing called specific heat capacity. I don't know if he did it. I have no reason to think he knew that. So he just, but each one he said one for Shabbos, he took a pot of water, and one for wine, he took a bottle of wine, and he heated it up to see what temperature it would be. So it had done at different times, and therefore came out with different numbers. Maybe that's a yishuv, how the science is going to help us be miyashav this seeming stira. But anyhow, as strange as it is that Ramesh gives different shiurim and different chuvas, it is. In fact, what's even more surprising is that the world follows those two shiurim exactly like he says them, not using one shiur. What I mean is like this: if you want to put milk into your coffee on Shabbos, you say. If it's in a klisheni, you say you could put milk in, and part of the reason why it's mutter is because ein b'shach habishal, because the milk was already cooked. Really, when was the milk cooked? The milk was cooked because it was pasteurized in the factory to make sure it doesn't spoil. Okay, well, and that's really nice because pasteurization happens at 160, 165 degrees. So I know my milk was mefushal. We say ein b'shach habishal. Under the circumstances, we're saying. Okay, this is not Shir and Hilchos Shabbos, but ein b'shach habishal plays a role in the fact that you're allowed to put your milk into the coffee. So wait a second, but that's only 160 degrees. So we're following what Moshe said for Shabbos. You could say ein b'shach habishal at 160 degrees. It's the same. Moshe's true is about ketchup, but excuse me, we say ein b'shach habishal for Shabbos. Then when we go to wine, when someone's making wine and they want to say it's mevushal, it shouldn't be able to become stam yayin. There, common hashgachas use the temperature 175, which is what Moshe said about stam yayin. So we follow that shita, even though they're not the same number. So sort of, they say Moshe said this number. That's what we follow. It's just interesting here we're seeing that in the practice where the specific heat capacity and the thermal conductivity play a role. Actually, the dinim people are following both, sort of not realizing or sort of not knowing why, but that's in fact what people do. They follow Moshe's numbers for the specific things that he said, even though they're not the same number, even though two different sets of halachas are not the same number, which actually may be more intelligent from a science perspective. It is a little unusual from a halachic perspective. Anyhow, so that's what we have to say about Yad Soledes Bo.